it's always such a cliche to start by saying our next guest needs no introduction. So I was thinking differently this time, and I'm going to say our next guest needs a greatest hits album. And I'm not kidding. I think it would be a great idea to make a Bret Easton Ellis textbook, a syllabus for universities, a reader. Because clearly what Joan Didion did for the 60s and 70s, Bret Easton Ellis did for the 80s and 90s. What Don DeLillo did with terrorism and conspiracy theories and mass media, Bret Easton Ellis did for celebrity culture and hedonism and consumerism. In the same way that John Updike chronicled man's longing for sex and pleasure and meaning, Bret Easton Ellis chronicles man's struggle with a surplus of sex and pleasure and a void of meaning. He is a writer whose style makes the horrible sound attractive and in turn makes the very attractive sound horrible. And if you were to make a Bret Easton Ellis greatest hits album, obviously you start by Less Than Zero, the Generation X defining novel of the mid-80s. You then escape the claustrophobia from Los Angeles and have the same kind of characters from The Informers and The Rules of Attractions who pop up at different places. You then reach in the Bret Easton Ellis reader, you'd reach the peak grim satire of one of the classics, not just of the 90s, but pretty much a classic of the past last 50 years, the scandal book that was American Psycho. And then after we came down from American Psycho, we'd slide down to the ridiculously cool and ridiculously funny Glamorama. And by then, in my imaginary Bret Easton Ellis reader, you'd see that the it boys and girls age, and you see them try and fail to settle down in Luna Park in imperial bedrooms. And if you compile such a greatest hits album, you'd see how Mr. Ellis's stories feed into each other, how they supplement each other, how they keep on broadening the horizon. The greatest hits album would also include, for example, Mrs. Ellis's amazing essay on a very public breakdown of Charlie Sheen and the way one form of American culture, let's say an upstanding American culture, is replaced for a slouching culture. But once you read the most recent part of the greatest hits, you read Mr. Ellis's newest book, The Shards. And it feels a bit silly to say, but this book changes everything. But to an extent, it really does. This book opens up a whole new window, a whole new perspective to Mr. Ellis's work. And for those who haven't read The Shards yet, or as it's called in Dutch, with our typical homegrown schuint te scherven, translated fabulously by Robert Jan Henkes. The Shards take us back to 1981, where a certain high school senior called Bret Ellis is working on his debut novel called Less Than Zero. Sounds familiar. It's Los Angeles, it's Bel Air. Blondie is playing on the radio. Chariots of Fire is in the movie theaters. Bret is in a relationship with Debbie. Debbie, quote, the fantasy boys could jerk off to. He's best friends with Susan and Tom, the type of persons who are only too easily crowned as prom king and queen. They're young, they're rich, they do coke, they have sex. They listen through Ultra Fox's Vienna. We still do, of course. They have lunch, and in the restaurants, the film stars lurk. This may sound a bit like Less Than Zero. It's not. Where Less Than Zero blocks off all emotions, the Shards let them in. And then all of a sudden you find that those kids you thought were careless aren't careless at all. They aren't jaded. They aren't world-weary, spoiled little rich kids. They care. They love each other. They're insecure. They're smart. They're funny. They worry. In Bret's case, he worries that people will find out he's having affairs with two guys. He worries about his girlfriend finding out. He worries about what it would do to the way he's perceived in the world. And this Bret gets obsessed with a new kid in high school, the elusive Robert Mallory, who may or may not be involved with a series of disappearances and murders of teenage kids in Los Angeles. And even though he clearly identifies Robert as a nemesis, he also feels attracted to him and feels that this Mallory is replacing him in a circle of friends. If Less Than Zero is a void, the Shard fills it. And don't get me wrong, Lesson Zero is a hell of a novel. I love it. But the Shards truly brings it to a whole other level. In the first chapter, Mr. Ellis writes that it took him 40 years to get to the point where he could write this book. And whoa, let me say, he knocked it out of the park. I did not expect to read the 600 pages as fast as I did, but it's just quite the page turner. Or as the cool kids these days would say, this book is a whole mood. I'm going to be asking him a bunch of questions. First, Mr. Ellis is going to come up, read from the book. I'm going to be asking him a whole bunch of questions, and let's say halfway, I'll open up the floor and see if there are any questions from the audience. And at the end, we'll also be able to ask some more questions. Let me just say this one thing. Before today, Mr. Ellis and I met once. I had to check it out. It was over 18 years ago, I believe in 2005. And we met for a full 16 seconds. We became best of friends so easily. I was in line to get my book signed at Scheltema Booksellers. And I don't recall what I said to him when it was my turn. Besides, I probably said, it's spelled J-O-O-S-T. But I do remember what the people in front of me in the line said. They asked him if they could take a picture with him. And Mr. Ellis kindly agreed. And then, when they wanted to take the picture, he said, "Wait, stop." And he turned and he said, "This is my good side." And I swear to God, ever since, when someone wants to take my picture, or any time a photographer says to me, "Hey, let's do something fun," I think, what would Bret Easton Ellis do? So let's ask him. Please give a warm welcome, Mr. Bret Easton Ellis.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here tonight. I didn't really have any remarks prepared. I think I was supposed to, but I think Joost will handle a lot of that. Joost will handle a lot of that. All I want to say about this book is that it was a book that I had wanted to write in 1982. I was in the middle of writing Less Than Zero when the Shards suddenly came to me. And it had a lot to do with what I felt was the movement I was making from adolescence into adulthood. That wasn't necessarily what Less Than Zero was about, but it really was what the Shards was about. And a series of events had happened that fall when I was 17, 18 at my school that led me to this revelation that I had actually lost my innocence, that I had actually entered into the corruption of adulthood. I didn't feel I had the chops or the talent to write the Shards, so I gave it up, and I tried going back to it many times over the past 40 years, and for some reason, about 2 or 3 years ago, it cracked. It just landed in my lap. I realized that at this point in my life, I was able to write this book. Less Than Zero at that time seemed like an easier book to write. Not a lot happened in it. Less Than Zero to me was a vibe novel. It was a hangout novel. In many ways, The Shards is like that too, to agree, but there's a lot happening in it that the 18-year-old writer just didn't quite feel prepared for, though I was prepared to write about Clay in Less Than Zero and his meandering life and the parties and this kind of idea of numbness as a feeling. That was my guiding aesthetic then. I was feeling it in 1979 and 1980, this idea that numbness wasn't a negation exactly, but that numbness was a legitimate feeling, much as happiness was, much as feeling sexy was, much as feeling sad was. And I wanted to find a way to put on the page this notion of numbness as a feeling and see if you could do that as a writer. Much as when I wrote American Psycho, I wanted to write about how do you put madness on the page without going all Stephen King or going crazy with, I don't know, fonts and capital letters and the character screaming all the time. How do you capture madness on the page? And that really was what American Psycho was about to me. I think there was a certain point where finally the Shards announced itself because I was old. And this is not the 18-year-old Bret narrating this book as I intended him to do in 1982 when I first tried to write this book. But it was the older man, 56, 57, looking back. And that opened a door, and it expanded the novel for me, and also allowed me to kind of tap into an emotional aspect of my life then that I just did not dare go to when I was writing Lesson Zero. I was too cool. I was too young. I wasn't vulnerable enough. And for some reason, when the Shards, again, just appeared before me a few years back, I guess I was ready to go to it. They've asked me to read. I don't really like to read in public, and I asked them to keep it short. Let's just no longer than 5 or 6 minutes. I think that's what it is. But this is from the beginning of the book. It's in a kind of foreword, a kind of preface. And as the book ends and all the terrible things happen, there's an afterword too. But this is the preface that's kind of describing the freedom that we felt as teenagers of the early 80s and the late 70s. And I really wanted to capture that. Yes, it was great, but it also opened some dangerous doors as well. And I want to talk specifically in this one passage, again, about 5 minutes, about what it was like in 1981 to be that teenager. And specifically me, because this is, for all of its outlandishness at times, and for all of its kind of Bret Easton Ellis type things, it really is the most autobiographical thing that I've written. Though I do have to say that when someone asks me why I never wrote a memoir, I have to tell them, well, I've written 9 of them. Every single book is a reflection of where I was at the time that I wrote it. And for better or for worse, those books make up my autobiography. Here are just a couple pages from the Shards. We were so autonomous at 16, but it never seemed like it was to our youthful detriment, because the week you got your driver's license in LA was when you became an adult. I remember when Jeff Taylor first got his car before any of us, and on a school night picked up Tom Wright in Beverly Hills, and then dropped by the house on Mulholland to get me, and then drove into Hollywood with the 8-track of Billy Joel's Glass Houses blasting You May Be Right. And we went to see a late show of Saturn III in the deserted Cinerama Dome. This was in February of 1980. I don't remember the movie, R-rated sci-fi starring Farrah Fawcett, only the freedom of being out on our own and without any parents involved. This was the first time we had driven by ourselves to see a 10 o'clock movie, and I remember hanging out in the vast parking lot of the Cinerama Dome as midnight neared, a deserted Hollywood surrounding us, sharing a joint, the future wide open. It was not unusual after I got my driver's license to decide at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday, after browsing my homework, that I would drive down the hill from the house on Mulholland and into West Hollywood to see the first set of the Psychedelic Furs at the Whiskey without asking my mother's permission. My parents were separated by that point in 1980. Because this had become a common weeknight out. I would just let my mother know that I'd be back by midnight, and then I'd slip out of the house and drive through the empty canyons with Missing Persons or The Doors playing, and park in a lot off Sunset, where I'd pay $5 to the attendant on North Clark. I would easily get into the Whiskey with a fake ID. Some nights I wasn't even carded. And in the club, I'd ask the Rastafarian by the bar if he knew where I could get any Coke. And the Rastafarian would usually point to a kid with platinum blonde hair in the back of the room, whom I'd walk over to and gesture at, slipping him a wad of folded cash before I ordered a whiskey sour, which was a drink I favored in high school, waiting for him as he checked something out in the manager's office and then brought me a small packet. Afterward, I would drive up the canyons and then cruise along Mulholland. Everything was deserted. I was high, smoking a clove cigarette, and descend Laurel Canyon and drive along the neighborhoods nestled above Ventura Boulevard. I'd start in Studio City, and then glide through Sherman Oaks, slowly in the darkness along Valley Vista until I arrived in Encino, and then past that into Tarzana, just idly driving by the darkened houses that lined the suburban neighborhoods, listening to the Kings until it was time to head back up to Mulholland. I'd take either Ventura Boulevard or the 101, and at Van Nuys, make the drive up Beverly Glen, and sometimes while heading home, catch the green flashes from the eyes of coyotes in the glare of the headlights as they glanced at the Mercedes while trotting across Mulholland, sometimes in packs. And I'd have to stop the car, waiting to let them prowl past. And I could always manage the next morning, no matter how late my nights played out, to pull into the Buckley parking lot, neatly wearing my uniform, minutes before the first class began, never feeling hungover or tired, but only pleasantly buzzed. If the spring and summer of 1981 had been the dream, something paradisiacal, then September represented the end of that dream with the arrival of a student named Robert Mallory. There was now the sense of something else moving in. Dark patterns were revealing themselves, and we began noticing things for the first time. A signal we had never heard before started calling out to us. I don't want to make a direct connection between certain events and the arrival of Robert Mallory in September of 1981 after that paradisiacal summer, but it happened to coincide with a kind of madness that slowly descended over the city. It was as if another world was announcing itself, painting the one we had all safely taken for granted into a darker color. For example, this became a time when homes in certain neighborhoods were suddenly being targeted and staked out by members of a cult whose purpose was hard to ascertain. The pale hippie hanging out at the end of the driveway, muttering to himself, his pacing interrupted by a brief shuffle dance. And later in December, there were plastic explosives planted all over town by the cult the hippies belonged to. There was suddenly a sniper on the roof of a department store in Beverly Hills on the night before Thanksgiving, and there was a bomb threat that cleared out Chasen's on Christmas Eve. Suddenly, we knew about a teenage boy who had convinced himself he was possessed by a quote-unquote satanic demon in Pacific Palisades, and the elaborate exorcism by two priests to rid the boy of the demon, which almost killed him. The boy bled from his eyes and went deaf in one ear, developed pancreatitis, and 4 ribs were broken during the ritual. Suddenly, there was the UCLA student buried alive as a prank by 5 classmates high on PCP at a fraternity party that a witness blandly said had somehow gotten out of hand, and who almost didn't make it, ending up in a coma in a darkened room in one of the buildings lining Medical Plaza. Suddenly, there were the spider infestations that bloomed everywhere across the city that fall. The most fanciful story that fall involved a mutation, a monster, a fish the size of a small car hauled out of the ocean off Malibu. Its skin was gray-white, and there were large patches of silvery orange scales dusted across it. And even though it had the jaws of a shark, it decidedly wasn't one. And when the thing was gutted by local fishermen, they found the bodies of 2 dogs who had been missing swallowed whole. And then, of course, there was the Trawler announcing itself. For about a year, there had been various break-ins and assaults, and then disappearances. And in 1981, the corpse of a second missing teenage girl was found, the other one discovered in 1980, and was ultimately connected to the home invasions. Everything might have happened without the presence of Robert Mallory, but the fact that his arrival coincided with the strange darkening that had begun to lightly spiral into our lives was something I couldn't ignore, even though others did. at their own peril. Whether it was bad luck or bad timing, these events were simply tied together. And though Robert Mallory wasn't the sniper on the roof of Neiman Marcus or the caller who emptied out Chasen's, and he wasn't connected to the violent exorcism in Pacific Palisades or anywhere near the fraternity house in Westwood where the pledge had been flung into an open grave, his presence, for me, was connected to all of these things. Every horror story we heard that fall, anything that darkened our bubble in ways we never noticed before, led to him.
Thanks. Bret, on the dust jacket of the Shards, there's a picture of the artist as a young man. It's taken from your yearbook of your high school, a picture of you when you were 18, 17. What do you see when you look at that picture?
I can locate in that picture, and what Juice is talking about is that I decided to use my Buckley yearbook photo from my senior year, my last year in high school. My publishers thought it was kind of an interesting idea, but a little off. But I thought, no, this book is about that senior year, and a lot of it happened to me. Now, of course, a lot of it didn't, but enough did that I wanted to use that photo of me. And part of the reason why that photo works for me, and I wanted it on the cover of the book, on all the international covers, though I don't think it made the Dutch cover. I don't think it made that. I think they used another photo. Was because it was a photo of a young man who was a writer, who wanted to be a writer, who was a fabulist, who was someone who was already writing novels. He was working on Less Than Zero. And he also had an imagination that got out of control and caused a lot of trouble. Caused a lot of trouble my senior year. I lied about things. I was gay, but I had a girlfriend, one of the most popular girls in school. I imagined connections between friends that weren't true. I believed the boy was in love with me. I believed actually that someone was connected to a criminal and that they were involved perhaps in the drowning of a boy who went to another private school. My imagination ran wild, and I see that boy in that picture that was taken my senior year, smiling. The smile's kind of fake. The smile's kind of a pose because the boy was kind of fake, and the pose was a pose. I was trying to fit into high school life in a way that I never had before because I didn't know what else to do. I was kind of lost, and I thought, okay, to make this all work, to survive in this school, which I hated. I didn't want to be in high school. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I was gay. I didn't need a girlfriend. I was working on a novel. I decided to kind of join the popular kids. And I did a number of things to do it. And the popular kids in our school, and I'm talking about a very small school with a class of only about 60 people, I pretended to be someone I was not. And in the novel, I refer to that person as the tangible participant. And when I look at that photo, all I see is the tangible participant. I don't see the real Bret. I don't know if anybody looking at this photo would notice that. Maybe a few people who went to high school with me would notice that. But that picture became, I don't know, emblematic of something that resides within the book and ultimately the tragedy of the book that happens at the end.
What precisely did you, because you make it sound like it's an obvious thing to do to join the popular kids, but I'm sure a lot of people in the class would say it's awfully difficult to join the popular kids. What do you recall what you did to fit in, besides just, kind of denying your sexuality or...
I thought that there was
I don't know. I just thought that there was, at a certain point in high school, I realized that in order to get through this and in order to make it move as smoothly as possible, maybe that was the thing to do. Get a girlfriend. Join the quote-unquote popular kids, which I easily did. I had lost a lot of weight. I had cut my hair. I'd been working out. I dressed differently. I was suddenly dating the most popular girl in school. My friends were, a star football player and stuff, and it was all kind of a lie. But I thought that the lie could get me through rather than the reality. Like, I didn't want to deal with the reality. I didn't want to deal with the reality that, what was expected of me and what was expected of a lot of kids in 1981 was to be this, to be that, to not be gay, to not be this, to not be the solitary, weird writer, which I was, but that there had to be an easier way to get through that time. And so the Shards really is, in many ways, a recounting of what I tried to do and failed at doing. On the other hand, what was so stupid about it in the end was that I was pretty okay on a certain level. I was solitary, but I wasn't lonely. I was working on a novel. I loved movies. I loved music. I loved reading novels. I mean, I did have that world. But then within the confines of this overwhelming world of high school, which was daily from 9 to 4 or 5 or whatever, there was a world that I felt, for whatever reason, in 1981, I don't know if I would have felt that now, that, okay, it's going to be a lot easier to just play the game, enact the role, be the tangible participant, get through it. You'll get through it a lot more quickly. That wasn't really true. It didn't really work out. A lot of people were hurt, and that was really the impetus to write the Shards in 1982.
So why didn't you write it until 2020?
I didn't have the chops. I didn't have the talent. I didn't know how to do it. It was like a movie. It was like a big widescreen movie. These ideas that I had thought of about what the Shards should be about and what it was like. Very much similar to what this published version is. I don't think anything is really that different than what I originally imagined in 1982. But Less Than Zero was easier. Less Than Zero had a vibe. It was a vibe book, if you know what I mean. It really wasn't about plot or narrative. It was about a vibe, a feeling. And it was also what I like to call a hangout book. You hung out with the characters. It didn't really necessitate a plot or a bunch of dramatic things happened. It was just sort of like, okay, well, I'm in this world. I'm going to this party. I'm hanging out with these guys at this, mall or whatever. And the whole thing felt like I could do that. I could do that at 17 and 18 and 19. The Shards just seemed too ambitious. And it eluded me in my 20s and in my 30s and in my 40s. I would always go back to the Shards after I finished a novel and could never could figure it out. And at one point, I just thought, well, you're never going to write that book. I don't have any books like that. I mean, I really have written every book I wanted to write. I don't have ideas for books that then I don't complete. I'm always very sure of a book by the time I write it because I do outlines. I do very long outlines, and when I write those outlines, then I get to the end of it and go, oh, okay, I know I definitely want to write this book. I cannot imagine just starting a book without any outline or without any map, because you get to page 152, and maybe it sucks. And that's like a terrible.
And then what? Yeah.
That happens a lot to people.
Yeah.
So I just couldn't figure it out until, as I said in the intro, God, this is not the story of an 18-year-old boy, which it is, basically, but it's being told by the 56 or 57-year-old man looking back at being 18, and that just opened up an entire room.
Because you say, I didn't have the talent, I didn't have the chops. Isn't it also a point of perhaps growing to have more empathy with the characters? Because that's clearly in this book I'm not going to say a departure from your previous work, but you write about these characters which, in my interpretation, you care about them much more than you seem to care about your previous main characters. You feel for them. There's much more sympathy towards them, I feel. I might be mistaken, of course, but that's my interpretation.
I felt a lot about Patrick Bateman. I really did. I did feel a kind of sympathy for Patrick Bateman. I have always felt empathy for every character that I've ever written. Without it, you can't write a novel.
Yeah, why would you? Yeah,
you have to care about them. Now, there's a difference between having that empathy and a certain kind of aesthetic distance and a kind of style that you want to present these characters within, whatever that world is. And at those stages in my life, in my 20s and in my 30s and into my 40s, I had an aesthetic that I was very, very interested in, and putting these characters within this aesthetic or reflecting this aesthetic to a degree. But that never meant that I didn't have empathy for them. I really did have empathy for Patrick Bateman when I was writing about him. I felt in a lot of ways that I was as confused as he was about where we ended up, where he ended up, where I ended up, at that time in the late 80s in Manhattan. Completely different people on a lot of levels, but at the same time, I felt like he was a reflection, a distorted reflection of me in terms of I had to accept that I was going to be moving into a society that I did not believe in. I did not believe in the values of late 80s, Reagan era, yuppie, whatever. I just didn't believe in them. It was the antithesis of the things that I did believe in, like poetry and novels and writing music and all these utopian ideas and everything. And then I realized, okay, well, this goes back to Buckley. I want to fit in. I also want to fit in, because where else am I going to go? What else am I going to do? I'm going to go hide in a cave someplace? No, I have to adapt to a society that I don't like. And when people do that, they go crazy.
Yeah, because American Psycho doesn't seem like the obvious way to fit in, writing American Psycho.
Say that again?
It seems like writing American Psycho isn't the obvious way to fit in, let's say, literary culture of that time.
I never cared about fitting into the literary culture. I never wanted to fit into the literary world. I never wrote books to fit in or get loved by critics or win awards or anything. I was not a career writer. And I knew some. I knew career writers. I knew career writers who knew exactly what their publishers wanted. I knew career writers who won awards exactly because they wrote the kind of book that they knew would win an award. And often I wished I was that. I remember during the heyday of my popularity then, Chuck Palahniuk and Douglas Copeland were publishing a book every other year, which was what my publishers wanted me to do. I could not write a book unless I felt it. That was my flaw. That was my flaw as a writer. Unless I felt it, it wasn't going to be written. And so when you say that about American Psycho, I mean, American Psycho was deeply felt, and it took like 3 or 4 years to write, and I cared about Patrick Bateman on one level. He was horrendous, or fantasizing himself as a horrendous person, but he was right about a lot of things. Patrick Bateman is actually one of the more sane people in that world. And that's what was so interesting to me. And the other question that I could never answer, and I didn't want to, was, is he doing this or is he not? Is this a fantasy that I'm writing, or is this a reality? And part of what made that book so gripping to write was that I didn't know the answer to it. And I think also one of the reasons why that book is still even talked about or relevant is because of that very question. That is the one thing that is always asked about it. But in terms of what you're saying about wanting to fit in, I wanted to fit in like a human being with other people and men and women and the world that was tangible. I didn't ever want to fit into the literary world. I didn't even, believe me, I did not want to get good reviews or any of that. None of that mattered. All that mattered was the book. The book was bliss, happiness. I loved having a book. American Psycho was a joy to write.
Yeah, weirdly enough, it reads like that.
It was a joy to write. It was hilarious. I laughed my ass off writing American Psycho. I also made myself sick a couple of times, And
But I remember reading the articles where there's this whole internal monologues of Patrick Bateman just going on about, all kinds of pop stars of the moment. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, this guy is having fun.
Everyone talks about God. It must have been so hard to write those gruesome murder scenes in American Psycho. And they were to a degree. I saved them to the end of the book. I didn't know really how to write them. I relied on FBI textbooks and stuff and got the gorier details from, reading like Anne Rule's books about Ted Bundy or whatever. They were kind of hard to write. But I have never, ever in my life had a more difficult writing experience than the month I had to write about Genesis.
Yeah.
I never did.
Not a fan?
No. Genesis and Whitney Houston.
Yeah, Whitney, I remember.
And
I remember listening to Whitney Houston after I read the book, thinking, oh, there's more than Whitney Houston that meets the eye.
I was obsessed. And I knew Patrick Bateman would be obsessed, and so it all kind of made an aesthetic sense. But no, I've never written about a character that I haven't had empathy for. I think with the Shards, though, and it happens with age, is that a kind of new sincerity enters into the picture at a certain point. You don't really want to play the mind games that you might have played with Glamorama, which was a novel that I spent 8 years on. I loved it. I loved writing Glamorama. I loved hanging out with Victor Ward. I loved being in that world. I didn't want to stop writing it. Many people said I should have at a certain point, but I didn't. I loved writing it. And I had a ton of empathy for Victor Ward because at that point in my life, when I suddenly had this burst of post-American Psycho notoriety and celebrity, that's when Glamorama really came together for me in terms of this idea of one person being seen as someone that they're not, and then being replaced by a double. And whoever's read the book, you know the story. But I've had empathy for every single character I've ever written, but that does not mean that I want to fit into the literary landscape or the literary culture. I haven't, and I've never. And they haven't wanted me to, I don't write book reviews. I've never been nominated for a prize. I am the worst reviewed writer of my generation in America. There's no doubt about it. I am. And so that's just how it is. But none of that matters. Fitting into that, none of that matters. What matters is the book, writing on the book, and that's where the pleasure is. Everything else I'm disconnected to.
You spoke about sincerity just now. And was it for you, I think more than any other book, of yours, the main character being gay takes center stage. Was it something you also had to grow into, writing about it in such a, open way or a more vulnerable way, it seems?
I'm thinking about right now, like reaching for that pitcher and pouring myself some water, and I'm afraid I'm going to drop it. And I've been considering picking the pitcher up.
Yeah, it's always a tricky moment.
And I'm thinking, what if I drop the pitcher? What if it spills all over the table? What did you ask?
Just go ahead and take a sip first.
And please don't applaud. Don't applaud the old man being able to pour a pitcher of whatever water. I did it. Wow. Okay, ask the question again.
The question was again, more than any other book, the gayness of the main character takes center stage.
Oh, I know.
And we were having dinner just now, and you said you had dreams waking up saying it's too gay, it's too gay.
It's so ridiculous. The book got excerpted in Esquire magazine in the United States and I guess in Britain. Huge excerpt. And they paid fairly good money for it. And I didn't know what the excerpt was. I think I maybe knew. I think it had been run by me. But it had to do with the opening and how the serial killer in the book operates and the girls he kills. And it does open with that. But then it moves into a section, this excerpt that was in Esquire, about the main character having this clandestine relationship with a fellow classmate who's male, and their sexual relationship. And there is some, explicit gay sexuality going on in this excerpt. And I just wondered why Esquire, this men's magazine, would be publishing this. And I was a little wondered about that. Maybe I'm old and that's why I think, maybe it's cool, you know? Maybe it is cool that they did that. And so I woke up a couple days. My boyfriend said, do you know that you've woken up in the last 3 days saying, it's too gay. The whole thing's too gay. It's too gay. What are you dreaming about? What's too gay? What are you thinking? And I'm thinking, the book is, and the Esquire thing is. It's all too gay. It's all too gay. And that's why it's not going to, you know, the pressure of publishers and stuff and whatever, which I don't really care about as the publishing, as having dinner with my publishers here can attest, I don't care. I mean, that's your problem, you deal with it. But I was just wondering, like, if that really plays and if people are interested in that or not. And so that was my own problem and whatever. But I guess the larger question is just like writing about that now and dealing with it, right? And just, well, you know, you get to a certain age, and that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about 1981. And yes, there's as many heterosexual sex scenes in this book as there are gay sex scenes. So it was really kind of about this duality that I was going through as a young man at 17 and 18, where I did have quite a hot girlfriend. But yet I was also on the side seeing a couple of people who were, as I was, closeted. And that these storylines kind of begin to collide and then, you know, kind of implode. So, but I felt the same way I felt about writing anything. It just felt kind of good to write about it. I enjoyed myself, like I do with everything I write. So I didn't feel, I did not over-intellectualize it, put it that way. I didn't think, well, it's time to write about this. It just flowed. It was like, okay, it's 1981, I was 17, what was I doing? Well, I was doing this and I was doing that, and you know. What I do find interesting now is that there is this kind of anti-sex thing going on in a way in terms of a lot of the reviews in America where they complained about how much sex was in the book, which surprised me because I don't think there was that much. But I guess what there is fairly explicit, and I don't know. I was surprised that seems to be something that people circle and have issues with.
Well, for me, it was more that in so many of your previous books, it was, well, clearly Victor Ward was having sex with men and women. And this very much...
Victor Ward wasn't having sex with men and women. Victor Ward was having sex primarily with women. He kind of bragged in order to be cool and fit in that maybe he fooled around with another guy. But he really only has sex with that one guy where he's kind of almost raped in that 8-page sex scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very long
sex scene. Victor Ward was, I thought, ostensibly more or less heterosexual.
Okay.
Just to clarify that, for those of you who have read Glamorama, so.
One of the things that surprises me is that...
Patrick Bateman, on the other hand.
Yeah.
Maybe the gayest character I've ever written. Maybe the gayest character I've ever written. Anyway, go on.
But I think earlier I said this book opens up a new perspective to Less Than Zero. How do you feel? Because it's clearly, if you read all this, and just previous month I read Less Than Zero for the 4th time or something, and it changed the way you look at the book. And by the book I mean Less Than Zero. Because you seem to know so much more about, you know, obviously you're projecting the one book into the other book. But let's say in this fictional universe where Bret Easton Ellis of the book, who may or may not be the same person as the author, is writing a book called Less Than Zero. So clearly the books feel connected to you.
He's doing that in the Shards.
Yeah.
The Bret Ellis in the Shards is talking about how he's writing the book Less Than Zero. Yes, and he talks about it with other people. True.
So can you imagine that? And it's kind of, I kind of felt stupid myself because I've read Less Than Zero years ago, read it many times over. I had to write about it, and with so many people it's seen as like the ultimate Gen X defining book about nihilism and consumerism. So it has almost this political value to a certain extent, that it it captures the time gaze, how do you say it? The zeitgeist, sorry, the zeitgeist. And now when I've read this book, I thought, oh, it's much more personal, Lesson Zero. It's not so much, it's just about Clay not being able to access his emotions because he wants to actively shut them out because he's so insecure. He's not careless. He's not indifferent. He just cares so much that he's afraid to access those emotions.
I was 18 and 19, and I felt that way as a cool kid. As a cool kid in that period, I felt that way, and Lesson Zero is a reflection of that. That is what I also thought was tied into that numbness as a feeling, numbness as something emotional. So sure, every book is different at every age you write it. And I would never write Lesson Zero now, just like I wouldn't write Rules of Attraction now, just like I wouldn't write American Psycho or Imperial Bedrooms, for example, where I was going through the darkest depression of my life, and I didn't even really want to write that book, yet when all of these things were collapsing around me in 07, 08, 09, I would go back to my room after a disastrous day at the studio or on the set or whatever.
Right? At the time, yeah.
Yeah, look, Imperial Bedrooms, if anyone wants to know, is my journal of making the Informers and having a nervous breakdown. And I turned it into a kind of Raymond Chandler noir. And I did switch the sex of the actor I had become obsessed with into an actress, whatever. So if anybody's interested in that, that was what. And then I threw in a drug cartel, and there were some other very noirish tropes in it. But I had to go to that book because it helped me. It saved me. It was something I could go to every night after this horrible day where I was locked into contracts, legally couldn't not do this, was forced to write reshoots of reshoots, lost friends, was involved with a crazy actor, all of this shit. But at night when I would go home and I would write this all out, peace. Things would lift off me as they usually do when I write, just as when I wrote the ending of Lunar Park. That was a powerful moment for me because it was when, and this sounds sappy as fuck, I don't care, I forgave my father. I just forgave my father for everything. And that had been a very tough thing to do for years and years and years. But writing helped me do that, and it's always helped me do that. So, every book is a mirror as to where I was in my life at that time. And so, of course, Lesson Zero resembles exactly what you said. What kills me about Lesson Zero, is that if I had only known how popular it was going to be, it would have been better written. If I only knew that it was going to sell millions and millions of copies, I would have done a better job. I cannot look at that book and see certain things that I wish I had done differently. And if it had sold 5,000 copies, I'd be fine.
Yeah.
But the fact that it is become like what you're talking about, you've read it 4 times, and we're referencing it here. It's like, oh my God, I look at page 20, and I just want to take a red pen through it. But I feel that way through. To be fair to Lesson Zero, I feel that way about all my books. All my books. So it's not just innocent little Lesson Zero. It's everything. After a certain point, I'm sure it's already happening with the Shards. It's already happening with the Shards. I had to do.
When you were reading just now, you thought, "Give me the pencil," and I'll.
Oh yeah, a couple times. Oh yeah. I added a couple lines that I thought were better. I added a word or two here or there because I thought it sounded better, and I took out a word or two. Yeah, I was self-editing while I was reading that. Yeah, it's just something that happens, and you just have to deal with it.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open up the floor for some questions in the audience. So think about a question you want to ask Mr. Ellis. Here's my question. One thing that surprises me in the book, there's this moment where Bret more or less lets himself get into this very Harvey Weinstein kind of situation, where he's more or less enticed to go to a hotel room and someone's there and already willing to take advantage of him. And Bret feels like he can escape, but he doesn't. And he says something like that he wanted to have the adult experience. And for me, it was such an interesting remark because reading the books, the characters already... Do you still see the characters as kids or as adults? Because they seem so grown up with their cars and their money and their parties and their society life.
There's a scene in the Shards where loosely based on something that I went through at 17. Look, first of all, I want to say, I thought I was taking advantage of them. Okay? And this is what happened was basically, there was an older producer, obviously interested in me at 17. I looked much different at 17. And was obviously had a little thing for me. I'd met him at one of these parties that my classmates' parents had thrown or whatever, and he took a liking to me. And he knew I liked movies, and I said I had a pitch for a film, and he said, I love this. And he did have clout. He made movies. And so he invited me over to his apartment and was being very enthusiastic. And I realized, oh, I have to have sex with him in order to get this moving to wherever it has to move. And so, in a way, I thought I was taking advantage of him because I thought doing that was going to move the project forward. The project never happened. I mean, it completely disappeared. And I felt like, that's tough. Because I really did try to do a really good job, and I really I wanted this movie to happen, and I knew in the back of my mind there was always this kind of thing maybe going on, but you know what it did? It toughened me up, and I became an adult. I did not call the police. I did not say I was assaulted. I helped take off my underwear, whatever. I mean, I thought I was going to get something out of it. Also, the casting couch situation in LA is not rape, it's not sexual assault, believe me. You talk to enough people out there who say, God, if I only knew I could get that part if I gave a blowjob, instead of going through the fucking months of casting and not getting it, I would give a blowjob to get a part. It's not, the horror show of it all, and we're, again, not talking about rape and blacklisting people. We're just talking about sexual favors being exchanged. It's so fucking common in Hollywood. And so I assumed that at 17 too. So there's a scene in the book where the Bret in the book has a very, very similar scene, but with a different character. And I've been taken to task for it because I had a very Gen X attitude about it. It was like, okay, so this thing happened. I walked into the room. I made a mistake. I don't really blame him or want to take him to court or anything like that. It certainly was a lot worse than whatever happened to that actor Anthony Rapp, who took Kevin Spacey to court over like pushing him onto a bed in New York. I mean, and he was underage and I was underage. I felt like it was a learning lesson. I felt like, oh, I'm entering into the world of adults. This is what happens. You have to deal with it, and you just sort of move on. That's what happened. And I write about it in the Shards. So. And he's dead. The guy's dead. So he's not going to sue me. He's not going to do anything. He's long gone. And so I finally felt that I could write about this scene. And I did so.
So when did that freedom change? The freedom, you talked about it earlier, the freedom you had growing up in the 70s and 80s. When did it start to slip away?
I think Trump. I think it was about that time. I think there was an overreaction to that, and that everything kind of collapsed. I don't think Me Too would have happened if Hillary Clinton got elected. It wouldn't have happened. I just don't think so. I think there was this overcorrection to Trump that then spread out into everything. It was uncontrollable. And it really did, unfortunately, affect the arts and artists. And it became this, the white man became the devil. The white man, it was pushed aside for, because of whatever Trump represented. And suddenly there was a push towards, something else. Maybe it was better, maybe it wasn't better, usually not. And I do think that people talking about language policing and triggering and sensitivity readers at publishing houses. I think all of that really came in the wave of 2015 and 2016 as an overreaction to Donald Trump. That's when I locate it, because it wasn't there before. It wasn't there. I didn't sense that during the Obama years, and I didn't sense it in the... certainly Twitter was fantastic, before, Trump was elected in a way. I mean, it was what it was. It was like the place to make the worst jokes possible and to say crazy and insane things and to just like, the notion of hate speech, what's even hate speech? I mean, hate speech wasn't even a thing until Donald Trump was elected. There was no such term, or toxic masculinity, or whatever, all of these terms that started coming out that chastise people for whatever. I mean, I'm not saying for being, a douche or someone who did something really bad. I'm saying these derogatory terms were being applied to just normal biological male behavior. That was new. And I had not seen that before. And so that, I think, did come in the aftermath of the Trump election.
You didn't seem to be very surprised by Trump winning the election, 2016.
Well, I gotta tell you, I am apolitical. And I know people gasp when I say this, but I'm in the majority of Americans who don't vote. I'm in the majority. The majority of Americans don't vote in elections. And I've never been political. I find it all absurd. I find it theater to a degree, and I think a lot of my distance from it does come from a privileged vantage point. I will completely be honest about that. My boyfriend, who is a passionate socialist, liberal nutcase sometimes, I think, is grateful I don't vote. He said, I would hate to think who you vote for. So good. Just don't. I'm going to vote instead, and that's fine. So it's not that I wasn't... when I was writing about that, the long chapter about Trump in White was really like wondering, first of all, why people were voting for him. And I was sympathetic to them because I knew a lot of people. My family, my friends in high school, my sisters, people I knew in West Hollywood. There were people voting for him. He won, so they did not exist. And I wanted to write about them. I wanted to know why they voted for them and what was going on. And I also wanted to know why the people who didn't vote for him were having these epic meltdowns that were so absurd, I had to capture them on page. I just had to do it. And I did it in a chapter in a series of restaurants where rich liberals who are breaking down over Trump over $1,000 dinners at Spago. It was just too rich to not touch. I mean, as a satirist, I had to write about it, So that was the impetus to write that section. But everything's an overreaction now. I mean, so it's sort of like, I don't know, maybe. I also wanted to capture that. I mean, why is everything pitched at such a high level?
So why is it?
I have no idea. Why do you think? I was trying to find an answer writing it. I mean, there's probably dozens. I don't know why everything's so high pitched. I think everything's so high pitched because everyone takes things so personally now. I think we basically live in an exhibitionistic culture where we are putting ourselves out there and we are overly sensitive to people's reactions to us. And therefore, when it's negative, we lash out in ways that are a lot louder than we should. And that's kind of a theory I have, but I don't know. As someone who doesn't care, as the worst reviewed writer in America, I've never written a critic. I've never called anybody up. Say whatever you want. So I think for me, like seeing this, the hysteria, the literal hysteria was unbecoming. It grossed me out, and I had to write about it.
Many of your books have been filmed. What is gained and what is lost seeing your books turn into movies?
The problem is that I write a lot of scripts, and those are movies, and the books I write are books. I don't write the books to be movies. I've never written a book to be a movie. All the novels that I've written are about style and consciousness. Style and consciousness. Screenplays are about structure. They're about structure, they're about economy. They're not about style at all, and they're not about consciousness, definitely. They are about storytelling and a certain kind of structure, and that is what a script demands. And I've written many scripts, those are movies, the novels are not. American Psycho is not a movie. And part of my problem and why I got slammed by some people is because it's a perfectly fine movie, but it is nothing like the novel. The novel is not filmable. I mean, the novel is about the consciousness of this man and his interior life and about things so hallucinatory and surreal that, you know, how do you put that on film? And yet Mary Harron did quite well. That's an entertaining 98-minute movie, no doubt about it. It's the greatest hits from the books. It really is the only scenes you can film. I mean, the other people did scripts too. They were like the fifth or sixth people to do that script, and everyone, including myself, took those same scenes. My script was very similar to the one they got credit for. Writers Guild didn't give me credit. We arbitrated, didn't happen, whatever. So, but it is a different experience because part of what is interesting about American Psycho is that the tension in it is at a certain point when you realize he might be an unreliable narrator that, for me, it gets 100% more interesting when I read a book like that. And I think, oh my God, the narrator is not telling us the truth. I'm even more gripped. I'm not frustrated. I'm even more gripped. With a movie, everything is literalized. You literalize the book because you're seeing it all happen. So that's a big problem with the adaptation of something like American Psycho. Now, I have to be thankful for American Psycho because it introduced an entire generation to that book. It still sells a ton of copies. I really do think because of the movie and Christian Bale's kind of iconic performance.
Yeah.
So, you know,
it's a very memeable movie.
It's there. Look, every Halloween, you won't even imagine the pictures I get of Patrick Bateman. People dress up as Patrick Bateman, and my Twitter feed and Instagram. It's like it's out of control. So I can only be thankful for that. I mean, the thing with American Psycho is that there was no one who wanted to make it into a movie except this one man who passed away last week, a great independent producer named Ed Pressman, who produced everything from Badlands and Phantom of the Paradise to Wall Street and beyond. Really great old-time producer. He was the only person who saw the movie version, a possible movie version of American Psycho. And so, to give him credit, compared to the other people who were involved at various times, you know, he did a great job. He did understand somehow, and though I don't think this is totally true, that he wanted a female perspective on this. And the other directors who'd been involved, the first one was David Cronenberg, who was going to do it, and Oliver Stone was going to do it. Those were the two directors before Mary Harron.
Names.
Yeah, big names. Yeah. And those deals didn't work. Another guy, Stuart Gordon, who had done Reanimator, was briefly in the mix, but not taken too seriously. But getting back to this notion of books being turned into movies, I mean, it's mostly not worked. Less Than Zero, I love that movie on a certain level because I love the look of it, the sound of it, the set design, the capturing of LA in that moment, but there is not a single word or scene from my book in that movie.
Yeah, it's quite
There's
different.
not one scene from my book in that movie. There's not one line of dialogue from my book in that movie. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
I still like it.
Yeah. It has a great cast.
It has a great cast. Yeah. The one movie that I do like, and I have to take blame for The Informers, which is the movie no one saw, which I talked about earlier because Imperial Bedrooms is about the making of The Informers. But I did like The Rules of Attraction a lot. I think that's the most successful adaptation of mine. For some reason, Roger Avery just got how to kind of take that kaleidoscopic nature of the novel and find the cinematic equivalent of it. And so I like that movie a lot. I really do like that movie a lot. But in terms of what it's about, you know, this is true. Out of the 100% of books that are bought and optioned, 2% are made. 2% are made.
Yeah.
So the odds are really terrible. You take the money and run. That's what Hemingway said. Just take the money and run. Let them option your book. Let them buy you out. And out of those that are made, the better the book, the worse the movie. It's always the case. The better the book, the worse the movie. And then there are like bad books that turn into good movies.
You said just now that your books are about style and consciousness. What precisely do you mean with consciousness?
I mean that you're entering into, I use narrators. I'm always using a narrator, and I always want to enter into their consciousness. But I also think that's true. Well, I think that's true of the great books. I think that that's true of Gatsby. I think that's true of Huckleberry Finn. I think that's true of Anna Karenina. You're entering into the Lolita. You're entering into the consciousness of not only the novelist himself, but also who this character is that he's focusing on, that means something to him, that represents something to him. And so you're entering into the consciousness of both in a way, the writer and this character. I think that's why Anna Karenina is one of the most thrilling books. I think Madame Bovary does the same thing. I think Sentimental Education by Flaubert is one of my favorite books. I think that happens with that book. And even stuff like George Eliot, Middlemarch, The Mill and the Floss. Edith Wharton does it brilliantly in some of her novels. She brings a consciousness into her consciousness, her concerns, and then melds them into the consciousness of the characters. And so the books become about that rather than just plot, narrative, story, action, whatever. They're about consciousness, and relaying that consciousness, you do it through style. Because without style, you don't have a book. Without style, you don't have a voice. Without style, you have a bunch of empty gestures, you have a bunch of plot points. I am not interested in a book that has the grabbiest, catchiest plot. I have to, at a certain age, it has to be written in a way to keep me going.
When did you learn that?
Hemingway. I was a voracious reader. I loved sci-fi. I loved horror. I loved any kind of story that grabbed me. I was very into the pop novels that my parents read. I picked up The Godfather by Mario Puzo like at 8 or 9. I mean, I was really precocious. I mean, I just loved reading, and I would read anything. And Stephen King was a big influence for me when I was when he first published. I read Carrie at 10. That book came out in 73, 74. I loved it. And I loved Salem's Lot and The Shining. I love those books.
Do you remember Cujo?
Oh, yes.
God,
well, Cujo's referenced in the Shards.
It scarred me for life,
It came out. And, oh, yes, of course, because he kills off the kid.
Yeah, he kills off the kid, yeah.
Spoiler.
Oh, sorry.
So
what was about Hemingway then?
Because Hemingway, when I read In Our Time and The Sun Also Rises at 13, something exploded in my consciousness, and it was, oh my God, the power of these stories and the power of this book isn't just because of what's going on, and there's some dramatic things going on. It's how it is told. It's how it is written. It was just a major, major revelation that changed the way I saw books and then made me want to be a writer. And then very soon after that, I discovered Joan Didion, who's also referenced a lot in the Shards, because my sensibility was being formed by her work as well. Her favorite writer, Hemingway. And so the two of them, in terms of just having this directness, but also this stylistic thing that I couldn't define. I would often type out Joan Didion essays, and I typed out some of the Nick Adams stories on my typewriter.
So you typed them just to get the momentum or the flow? Yeah.
To figure out how they did it, you know? And so, and what I realized by reading something like Play It As It Lays, Joan Didion's Hollywood novel that she published in 1970. Play It As It Lays in the hands of someone else could have been just a trashy B book, a Jacqueline Suzanne novel about a B-list actress who's doing drugs and has an abortion, and her husband leaves her, a friend commits suicide, all this Hollywood stuff. But in Joan Didion's style and her approach and her angle to this story, it was a portrait of hell. It was a portrait of hell, and it was done stylistically. The power of it wasn't from the fact that Mariah was just lounging by the pool, bleeding from the abortion that she just had. The power was in the specificity of the imagery, of the spareness of the language, of the whole thing being this kind of emotional experience that has to do with the way it was told and not what you were reading. And I mean, that sounds so obvious now, but for a young writer, it was invaluable. It was invaluable to know that that is how you could do it. That's how you, or that's, I'm not going to say how you should do it or not. Writers can write however they want, but that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question, and then we'll go back to the audience one final time and see if there are any questions left. When we started out, you write it in your book as well, and you told me you did so in real life, that you ordered your high school yearbook online. And of course, you have the picture of yourself on the dust jacket. But when you were scrolling through the yearbook, and you looked at all the faces of your generation, more or less, what did you feel? What did you think? What was your overarching emotion?
That we really had it during that period so much better than today. That we had this immense freedom that we had, even as a closeted gay kid, just looking at the culture in general, looking at wanting to have a ton of fun and just looking to be shocked and offended, and we wanted extreme experiences. No one was triggered by stuff. There weren't warnings everywhere. We weren't told when we turned in the store, you can't say that, you can't write that, you can't write in that person's voice. All these rules that are now everywhere. Zero. None of that was there. It was a very, very free world. And you were allowed to express yourself any way you could. There was not these microaggressions of hate speech or sexism or whatever. And it was just a kind of, looking back now.
But you even say that as a closeted gay guy at the time.
Look, when you talk to a lot of older gay men, they say the worst thing that ever happened to gay life was Stonewall. They said when gay life got politicized, everything went down the toilet. Because there was this glorious world, and you can read about it in endless books about Hollywood, Paris, Europe, New York in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Washington, D.C. There's a great book that came out last year called Secret City about Washington, D.C. There was a teeming gay life that was going on that was tolerated as long as it wasn't on the surface. That was just everywhere. That was glorious. It was free of politics. And there was this notion that the few people who did come out of it were these amazing rebels, whether it was Tennessee Williams or Truman Capote or Gore Vidal or whoever. It was just this kind of, I don't know. Yes, of course, problematic in terms if you were out and you got caught in a bathroom somewhere or whatever, but there was a kind of wonderful gay life that was below the surface that was very free of ideology or any of the other things that everyone is so concerned about now. Now, I'm not saying that's better, and I'm not saying we should go back to that, but I am saying that there was something, and I will admit this, when I look back at my life in 11th and 12th grade, there was a thrilling illicitness with being with the co-captain of the football team that was just super exciting, that no one knew about. We were little secret agents. We were doing our things on our own without anyone knowing, and it gave things kind of a thrill. I'm not saying that's preferable to not being able to get married or have the freedoms that gay people have now, but the two can coexist. I can think both ways. I can think about how cool Robert Mapplethorpe was and the things that he was doing, and that kind of underground, scene in New York, and also, well, I don't know, bros. I mean, is that really preferable? Is really like the sanitized gay kids we see in like Love, Simon or whatever what I want? No, I don't. And I see this sort of homogenized gay person, presented proudly in the press and in ads and whatever. And I think, how fucking boring. I mean, I just do. But that's just me, you know. I'm just an older gay guy, and I wish. I mean, I love Morrissey, you know, and Morrissey is completely condemned by the new gays. They can't stand that he has these opinions and that he leans this way politically or whatever. You know, as if everyone has to like fall in line and follow the same dictums and the same opinions, or else they're, you know. And that happened to gay life, you know. And I don't like that part of it, but certainly there are freedoms and stuff that is. But you know, the weird thing about gay life that I always thought was so great, and you have to understand that I'm 58, I thought two of the greatest things about gay life was that you didn't have to get married and you couldn't join the army. That's fantastic. Who wouldn't want that?
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bret Easton Ellis.